Every town has a dark side. I chose to cover today's case because it's one where the official explanation exists, but it doesn't hold up under pressure, not completely. The more you pull at the threads, the more the whole thing starts to fray. And what's strange is that this story isn't widely known. It hasn't made the rounds the way some cases do. But once you hear it, it stays with you. Because this isn't just a disappearance. It's a case where a man walked into the Wyoming prairie and left behind more questions than footprints. Hey guys, it's Kelvin. Thanks for tuning in to Everytown, where today we're heading out west for one of the strangest and most unsettling cases I've come across. This is the story of Don Kemp, a man who left everything behind to start over and may have vanished before he ever got the chance. To understand what happened to Don, you have to go back to the beginning. Because the man who drove west in the fall of 1982 wasn't the same man who had built a life in New York. Something had changed in him, and that change is central to everything that followed. Paul Donald Kemp Jr. was born on April 21, 1947 in Baltimore, Maryland. From the very start, Don was the kind of person other people looked to. At Woodlawn High School, he was voted most likely to succeed and served as class president 3 years running, sophomore through senior year. That's not ambition, that's just who he was. He went on to Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, where he studied history and English, became president of his fraternity, and graduated in 1969. By every outward measure, Don Kemp was exactly on track. After college, he did what a man like him was supposed to do. He moved to New York City and stepped into the world of Madison Avenue advertising. Think sharp suits, sharp ideas, and a culture built entirely around winning. Don thrived there for over a decade. Friends and colleagues described him as intelligent, articulate, and driven, someone who could command a room without ever needing to take it over. But in 1976, everything changed in an instant. Don was riding in a taxi when it was involved in a serious crash. The injuries were severe. He suffered debilitating back pain and whiplash that left him bedridden for months, and the recovery stretched nearly 2 full years before he was physically able to return to work. And when he did return, the people who knew him best noticed almost immediately that something was different. His sister Kathy would later describe it. Simply, he wasn't the same. The long months of stillness had given Don time to think and read and sit with himself in a way his old life had never allowed. And what he found in that quiet was a growing disillusionment, not just with advertising, but with the whole idea of chasing status and material success. One of the things he turned to during that time was history, and not just any corner of it. Don became deeply absorbed in the story of Abraham Lincoln and the people surrounding the assassination. He became particularly fixated on Mary Surratt, the woman who ran the boarding house where the conspirators gathered, including John Wilkes Booth. Mary was the first woman ever executed by the United States government, hanged for her alleged role in the plot. And Don developed his own theories about what she actually knew and what she actually did. What started as curiosity hardened into something closer to a mission. He read constantly, took extensive notes, and talked about the subject at length with anyone willing to listen. By 1982, Don had made a decision. He ended his engagement, sold most of what he owned, packed up his Chevy Blazer, and pointed it west toward Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The plan, at least on paper, was straightforward. Leave New York behind, settle near the mountains, and finally write the book he had been carrying inside himself for years. That drive west would turn out to be the last one Don ever made. In September of 1982, Don set out across the country, and for a while, everything seemed fine. He stayed in regular contact with his family, sent postcards along the way, made phone calls. Nothing in his tone suggested anything was wrong. If anything, he sounded focused and settled, like a man who had finally made peace with a decision. His last postcard was sent from North Platte, Nebraska, postmarked November 12th. 2 days before that, on November 10th, Don called his mother, Mary. He told her the trip was going well, that everything was fine, but before he hung up, he said something that stopped her. He said, "Mom, I really love you." It wasn't the kind of thing Don typically said, not because he didn't feel it, but because that simply wasn't how he expressed himself. Mary would carry that moment with her for the rest of her life. The words and the way he said them were different. different from the Don she knew. 5 days later, on November 15th, Don visited the Old West Museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Staff and other visitors would later recall seeing him there, alone, moving quietly through the galleries for nearly 2 hours. He didn't speak to anyone. He just wandered, taking his time. Nothing about that stood out. But when he left, he made a mistake that didn't fit the Don anyone knew. He forgot his attaché case. Inside it were his traveler's checks, his diaries, his driving glasses, and his address book, essentially everything he needed to continue on. Museum staff noticed it quickly and reached out to him. Don thanked them and said he'd come right back to pick it up. He never did. That museum visit was the last confirmed sighting of Don Kemp alive. The following day, November 16th, police located Don's Blazer abandoned along a rural stretch of highway. What caught their attention wasn't just the empty vehicle, it was the details. The engine was still running, the doors were standing open, personal belongings scattered across the roadway, and leading away from the driver's side, heading north into the open prairie, was a single set of footprints pressed into a light dusting of snow. Search teams followed those tracks for roughly a mile before they came across a duffel bag. Inside were clothes, laundry soap, and a teapot, all confirmed to belong to Don. The footprints kept going. 5 miles out, they ended at an abandoned barn. Near the barn, investigators found a small pile of sticks arranged carefully, the kind of arrangement someone makes when they're trying to start a fire. Scattered nearby were 3 of Don's socks. But here's the part that stopped everyone cold. There were no footprints leading away from the barn, in any direction. The snow around the structure was completely undisturbed, flat, smooth, untouched. Search teams circled the barn, went inside, checked every angle. There was nothing. No trail out, no explanation for where Don had gone. Police turned to the air. For nearly 2 hours, helicopters swept low over the search zone. The Wyoming prairie out there is wide open and almost featureless. In that kind of terrain, a person standing still should be visible for miles, but there was nothing to see. On the 3rd day, a massive blizzard moved in. Visibility dropped to near zero. Temperatures fell hard and fast. The search was suspended. The reasoning was tragic and practical. If Don hadn't succumbed to exposure by that point, he wouldn't survive what was coming. To many of the searchers, the explanation felt tragically simple. A man in some kind of mental or emotional crisis walked away from his vehicle and died in the wilderness. But that conclusion didn't close the case, and for Don's family, it didn't come anywhere close to answering what they needed to know. In April of 1983, 5 months after Don vanished, a woman named Judy Ilo came home from an extended vacation in Europe. Judy had worked alongside Don for nearly 10 years at their advertising firm in New York. They were close. But while she was overseas, no one had been able to reach her. She had no idea Don was missing. When she walked through her door and hit play on her answering machine, she found at least 5 messages waiting. The caller never identified himself, but Judy didn't need him to. She was certain she recognized the voice, a man she had worked beside almost every single day for a decade. The voice on the tape sounded strained, urgent, almost panicked. Much of what he said was difficult to make out, but one phrase came through clearly. "I must talk to you." He left a phone number. Now here's the detail that matters. Judy's number was unlisted. In 1983, before the internet, before any of the tools we take for granted now, an unlisted number wasn't something a stranger could simply look up. To have it, you either knew Judy personally or you had access to records that weren't meant to be public. Don Kemp would have had that number. It would have been in his address book, the one left behind in the attaché case at the museum. When Judy called the number back, a man answered. She asked if Don Kemp was there and explained she was returning his calls. There was a pause. Then the man said yes. Almost immediately, he corrected himself and said no. Judy pressed him, asked him to pass along a message that she had called. He agreed and hung up. She tried again the next day. This time, when she asked for Don, the man on the other end shut it down completely, said he didn't know anyone by that name, and ended the call. When authorities traced the calls, they found something that shouldn't have been possible if Don had died in a November blizzard. The calls had been originated from a rented trailer in Casper, Wyoming, roughly 150 miles from where the Blazer had been found, and they hadn't been made just once. Phone records showed calls on 3 separate dates, 2 on February 27th, 2 more on April 5th, and 1 more on April 10th. Someone had been repeatedly trying to reach Judy Ilo on her unlisted number months after Don Kemp was supposed to be dead. The trailer was registered to a young man named Mark Dennis. When investigators brought him in, Dennis denied everything, said he hadn't made the calls, said he didn't know Don Kemp. His explanation was that someone else had used his phone without his knowledge, or that the phone company had made an error. When shown a photograph of Don, he said he had never seen the man. At first, Dennis seemed willing to cooperate. He even agreed to take a polygraph. But before that test could happen, he retained an attorney and stopped talking entirely. 3 weeks later, he moved out of the trailer and left Casper, relocating to Evanston, Wyoming, on the other side of the state. Law enforcement later stated that beyond the unexplained phone calls, they had no evidence connecting Mark Dennis to Don's disappearance. In their official view, he was not a suspect. The matter was closed. But the phone calls weren't the only reason to believe Don may have survived longer than anyone wanted to admit. In the months following his disappearance, 2 separate people reported seeing Don Kemp in Casper. One sighting occurred at a traveling Abraham Lincoln exhibition, exactly the kind of event that would have pulled Don in given his intense focus on Lincoln and the people around him. The other came from a local bar, where a bartender later told Don's mother that he clearly remembered serving a man who matched Don's description. On their own, sightings like those are easy to dismiss. Mistaken identity happens. False leads happen, especially when reward money is involved, as it was here. But when you put those reports alongside the phone calls, alongside the unlisted number, alongside that initial yes before it became no, the picture gets harder to wave away. At least one law enforcement official floated the theory that Don had staged his own disappearance, that he had deliberately walked away from his old life to start a new one somewhere else, and honestly, parts of his story seemed to support that idea on the surface. He had sold most of his possessions. He had ended his engagement. He had walked away from his career. The abandoned Blazer, the scattered belongings, the careful arrangement of sticks near the barn, it could all be read as deliberate, almost theatrical. But that theory runs into a wall on October 4th, 1985. Nearly 3 years after Don vanished, a group of deer hunters traveling through an area called Willow Spring, roughly 4 to 6 miles north of where the Blazer had been found, came across skeletal remains. Next to the bones were a social security card and a driver's license. Both bore the name Don Kemp. Before dental records were compared, before any formal forensic identification was complete, Sheriff Ogburn went to the press. His conclusion was firm. Don Kemp had walked away from his vehicle, become disoriented as the blizzard approached, and died of exposure, likely within the first 2 or 3 days. An autopsy supported that ruling. No evidence of foul play, death by exposure. But the questions didn't go away. The location where those remains were found had been searched multiple times, on foot, from the air. It sat directly along the path the original footprint trail had followed, in open terrain with almost no cover. If Don had been there when searchers were looking, someone should have found him. One possible explanation is that he wasn't there yet, that he survived longer than anyone assumed, made his way into the area after the search was suspended, and died there days later. That would explain why he wasn't found during the initial sweep. It's possible. But if that's true, then who was making calls to an unlisted number in Casper in February and April of 1983? Who was seen at the Lincoln exhibition? Who answered the phone in that trailer, said yes, then changed it to no? None of the answers line up cleanly. Not one explanation accounts for everything. So let's slow down and look at what we actually know for certain. Don left his attaché case at the museum in Cheyenne. Inside that case was his address book, which would have contained Judy Ilo's unlisted number. That gives us a clear path for how someone in Wyoming could have obtained her contact information. If the address book was taken from the museum, whether intentionally or not,
Whoever had it had access to everyone Don knew. The simplest explanation for the calls is a cruel prank. Someone finds the address book, sees the reward being offered, and decides to play games with the people trying to find him. That would explain why the messages were vague and contained no real information. And it would explain why Mark Dennis insisted he knew nothing. But the simpler explanation has a problem. Judy Elo had worked side by side with this man for nearly a decade, and she was certain, not guessing, certain that the voice on those tapes was Don's. That's not nothing. The darker theory is that Don was being held in that trailer when Judy called, that someone had him, and that the yes followed immediately by no was the sound of a man trying to reach out before being silenced. It would explain Judy's certainty about the voice. It would explain why Dennis lawyered up and disappeared to the other side of the state. But it would also require an extraordinarily complicated chain of events, an abduction, months of captivity, a staged crime scene, and a body eventually returned to an area that had already been searched, all without leaving a single piece of traceable evidence. The third theory centers on Don's mental state. His diaries, recovered from that attaché case, contained entries referencing spiritualism and what he described as a kind of divine purpose. He told at least one acquaintance that he believed he was destined to gather people in Wyoming, that he saw himself as a chosen figure, a leader meant to guide others. When you place that alongside the trauma of the accident, the years of recovery, the abrupt dismantling of his entire life, a picture emerges of a man who may have been in significant psychological distress without fully realizing it. Under that framework, the footprints, the arranged sticks, the missing socks, none of it was staged. It was the result of a mind no longer operating clearly, a man walking into the open prairie because something in him said to. And search and rescue teams always assume that a missing person wants to be found. Maybe, in whatever state Don was in, he didn't. That explanation is tragic, but it is internally consistent, right up until you try to account for those phone calls, and the voice Judy Elo says she recognized without hesitation. Don Kemp walked away from his Blazer on November 16, 1982. His remains were found almost 3 years later, in terrain that had already been searched, with no clear explanation for how he got there or what happened in the months in between. The case never officially closed. In 2014, Mari Kemp, Don's mother, passed away at 86 years old. She died believing that Mark Dennis had killed her son. Dennis has never spoken publicly about the case. No journalist has tracked him down. No researcher knows where he is today. He left Casper and disappeared from the story just as completely as Don disappeared from that Wyoming prairie. Some cases end with answers. This one ends with a phone ringing in an unlisted number, a voice that sounds like a dead man, and a yes that someone almost immediately took back. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Everytown. Thanks for spending some time with me. If you want to keep going, there are more cases waiting on the channel, each one stranger than you might expect. Come back next week for another episode of Everytown, filled with strange and unsettling stories. Because you never know, maybe your town will be next.